Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The lost village of Anjikuni Lake. In the deep stillness of a northern winter night in 1930, a tiny lakeside community in the Canadian Arctic quietly slipped into legend. The story of the so-called vanishing village of Anjikuni Lake has been told and retold for nearly a century. It is a tale that unfolds like a gentle snowfall, slowly, silently, and with an eerie calm. In this sleepy, meditative documentary narrative, we will explore every known detail and theory of the Anjikuni mystery through historical accounts, cultural context, and comparisons to other strange disappearances. The aim is to understand how truth and myth intertwined in this enduring Arctic legend. We begin on a cold November evening with a lone fur trapper trudging through the snow. Chapter 1. Into the Silent Village. The wind was picking up as Joe LaBelle, an experienced fur trapper, trudged along the snowy trail by the shores of Lake Anjikuni. It was November of 1930 in the far north of Canada, and darkness was falling early. LaBelle's breath curled in the freezing air. He was exhausted from a long day's trek through the subarctic wilderness and yearned for warmth and shelter. Fortunately, he knew there was an Inuit village ahead, a familiar haven where he had rested on previous journeys. By all accounts, this small settlement of perhaps 2 or 3 dozen men, women, and children was usually a bustling, welcoming place. Light from oil lamps and hearth fires would glow through hide-covered lodge openings, and the sound of chatter or children's laughter might carry on the wind. As LaBelle approached that evening, however, he was struck by an unsettling quiet. Only the crunch of his snowshoes broke the silence. No voices, no barking sled dogs, nothing. The village appeared utterly dark and still. At first, LaBelle had wondered if he had arrived at the wrong spot, or if everyone was simply asleep early. Yet it was barely dinner time, and usually the community would be active preparing the evening meal. A prickling sense of unease grew with each step as he entered the cluster of snow-dusted huts and tents. The trapper called out a greeting, but his voice faded without any reply. He moved from one snow-covered tent to another, peering inside each dwelling. What he found only deepened the mystery. In one tent, a pot of stew hung above cold embers, an unfinished meal apparently left untended. Another shelter contained a half-mended garment with a needle still stuck in it, as if someone had been in the middle of sewing and suddenly stopped. Supplies of dried fish and smoked meats were neatly stored, and personal belongings, caribou fur parkas, bone tools, cooking pots, all remained in place. Everything looked as if the inhabitants had expected to return at any moment. Yet, there was no one at the village. It was completely deserted. LaBelle's heart pounded, not from exertion, but from the creeping anxiety of the scene. The quiet was eerie. He noticed that even the usual sled dogs were absent from view. Snow had begun to drift into the empty doorways of the huts. The trapper forced himself to methodically search every structure for any sign of the people. A few old campfires were still faintly smoldering, their faint tendrils of smoke coiling upward in the dusk. That meant someone had tended them not long ago, perhaps earlier that day. Yet, the owners of these fires were nowhere to be seen. As night fell, LaBelle gathered some wood and coaxed one of the fires back to life to provide light. In the flickering amber glow, he double-checked every corner of the settlement, calling out the names of villagers he knew. Only echoes of his own voice answered him. The sense of abandonment was total and uncanny. After a thorough search, LaBelle had to accept that the approximately 25 to 30 villagers, accounts vary but the number was small, had vanished without a trace. He could not find any tracks leading away from the camp, though by then a new layer of snow had begun to fall, which could have obscured footprints. The trapper felt a chill unrelated to the winter air. Something truly bizarre must have happened here. Gathering his resolve, he decided he could not linger alone in this ghost village through the freezing night. Though he was exhausted, the prospect of sleeping in one of those silent tents, surrounded by invisible mysteries, was too unnerving. He resolved to push on to get help, even if it meant a long march in darkness. Before leaving, LaBelle made one more disturbing discovery on the outskirts of the camp. Near the edge of the village stood a small burial ground, a customary place where the community laid their dead to rest under cairns of stones. In the dim firelight and moonlight reflecting off the snow, LaBelle saw that one of the graves had been disturbed. The stones that had formed a protective pile over the grave were carefully set aside, and the grave was open and empty. It was as if someone had exhumed the body that had been buried there. The arrangement of the stones was neat, not scattered, suggesting this was not the work of an animal scavenger. A human hand had deliberately removed the stones and taken the remains from the grave. Why would anyone do such a thing? And who? The villagers themselves? An outsider? LaBelle did not have the answers, but the sight filled him with dread. The idea of someone digging up a grave in the already haunting context of the empty camp felt almost like walking into a nightmare or a scene from a ghost story. Pulling his coat tighter against the biting wind, LaBelle realized it was now urgent to report what he had found. This was no ordinary situation of a family simply moving camp. An entire village had seemingly evaporated into the Arctic night. LaBelle left the village behind and set out as fast as he could for the nearest telegraph station, many miles away, to alert the authorities. Chapter 2: Clues in the Snow. After several grueling hours traversing frozen lakes and dark forest trails, Joe LaBelle reached a telegraph outpost, likely at a larger trading post or village such as the Pas, Manitoba, where he could contact the police. He sent an urgent message to the nearest detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, in those days often still called by their earlier title, the Northwest Mounted Police. The message relayed his startling findings: a whole Inuit village by Lake Anjikuni abandoned overnight over mysterious circumstances. LaBelle emphasized the eerie clues he had witnessed: half-cooked meals left behind, unfinished chores, no signs of struggle or violence, but also no footprints or tracks leading away, at least none visible when he searched. He also mentioned the troubling detail of the open grave. Understandably, the police were skeptical at first. Such a claim sounded more like a fable than a report of fact. Nevertheless, given the possibility that people's lives could be at stake, the RCMP organized an expedition to verify the situation. A team of Mounties set out as soon as they could, traveling by dog sled through the sub-zero temperature towards Lake Anjikuni. Constable J. Nelson, stationed in the region, was one of the officers involved in following up on LaBelle's report in the coming days. Along the route, the police patrols happened to meet another trapper, Armand Laurent, traveling with his 2 adolescent sons. The officers asked Laurent and his sons if they had seen anything unusual in the area recently. Laurent hesitated, then admitted that a few nights prior they had observed a strange phenomenon in the sky. According to later retellings of Laurent's account, he described seeing a large, gleaming object flying overhead. He claimed it was airborne, changing shape, and moving toward the direction of Lake Anjikuni. This was an odd thing to confess to the police. Perhaps he thought it might be relevant if something truly strange had occurred at the village. The Mounties listened politely. At the time in 1930, the idea of an unidentified flying object would not have been part of everyday vocabulary, but Laurent's description sounded like no known aircraft of the era. The officers made a mental note of this story of mysterious lights in the sky, but their immediate concern was reaching the village site and looking for tangible evidence of where the people had gone. When the RCMP search party finally arrived at the forlorn village by Lake Anjikuni, they indeed found it just as Joe LaBelle had described, in the pale daylight of the Arctic winter, a brief twilight rather than full sun at that time of year. The scene was grim and perplexing. The tents and huts stood silent under a dusting of snow. Inside, belongings were intact and supplies abundant. Clearly, this had been a well-provisioned camp. prepared for the harsh winter. There was no sign of ransacking or theft. Valuables like rifles, knives, and cooking gear were left in place. The Mounties saw for themselves the cooking fires and drying racks, with food still on them. One constable found a stew that had been left in a pot, now frozen solid, confirming LaBelle's report that meals were abandoned mid-preparation. Warm winter parkas and boots were found neatly stacked, which was deeply puzzling. Why would anyone venture out into the lethal winter cold without their heavy clothing? The search party spread out methodically over the camp and its surroundings. They discovered, tragically, the fate of the sled dogs that LaBelle hadn't initially seen in the dark. Just beyond the main encampment, they found a team of dogs, reportedly 7 in number, all dead and frozen, still tethered to sturdy posts. These poor creatures had evidently been left behind and died of starvation and exposure. A dusting of snow covered their bodies, indicating they had been dead for some time, perhaps weeks. The Mounties were shocked. For any northern traveler or hunter, sled dogs are vital companions for survival. It was virtually unthinkable that an Inuit family or any experienced northerner would simply leave their dogs tied up to die in such a manner. Dogs were precious for transportation and often treated as part of the family or working team. If the village had made a planned relocation, they absolutely would have taken their dogs, or at the very least, released them to give them a chance at survival. The presence of the deceased tethered dogs was one of the strongest indicator that whatever occurred must have been sudden and unplanned, something that caused the inhabitants to leave or be taken in a great hurry or under duress, with no opportunity even to untie their animals. The RCMP team also examined the village burial ground as LaBelle had described. They found more than one grave disturbed. In some accounts, it said that a single grave was opened. Other later embellishments claimed that multiple graves were found empty. The officers on site noted that at least one grave had been dug up deliberately. Stones that had been carefully placed to mark and protect the grave were set aside in an orderly fashion, just as LaBelle reported. The body was missing. This deeply troubled the investigators, as it would any observer. Disturbing a grave is an act against both law and the spiritual taboos of the Inuit. Why would someone go to the effort of unearthing an already buried corpse? If the villagers themselves had fled, did they carry away their dead for some reason? That seemed unlikely, as relocating even the living was challenging enough. If an outsider had perpetrated some harm, why dig up a grave? The empty grave remained one of the most haunting clues of the Anjikuni site, hinting at a scenario beyond the ordinary. The Mounties searched a wide radius around the village for any footprints, sled tracks, or other evidence of where the approximately 24 missing people could have gone. They found no footprints in the fresh snow beyond the camp itself. Given the time that had possibly passed in subsequent snowfall, it was not conclusive evidence. Any tracks could have been erased by weather. Still, Not finding any trace of a large group's departure was unsettling. The lake's surface was by this time likely frozen, as Lake Anjikuni typically would freeze by late fall, so travel by canoe or kayak was out of the question. If the villagers had somehow taken to the lake, it would have had to be on foot or sled over the ice. But no sled marks were apparent, aside from those of the Mounties' own sleds arriving. Inside one dwelling, an officer picked up a discarded rifle and inspected it. It was found to be in good working order, loaded, ready to fire. Why would hunters leave behind their firearms, essential for defense in procuring food, unless something very urgent made them drop everything? As the investigators combed through the evidence, one small detail offered a potential timeline. One story holds that the Mounties found a cache of provisions, such as berries and fish, whose state of decay or dryness suggested that the village had actually been empty for some time, possibly up to 2 months. For example, berries that had been gathered and stored were now weathered and desiccated far beyond what a few days' neglect would cause. If true, this would indicate the villagers might have disappeared roughly 2 months prior to LaBelle's arrival. That would place the incident around September 1930. However, this detail is a bit murky. It may have been an inference or a later embellishment by storytellers. Official records from the initial investigation are sparse, but if the village had indeed been abandoned for weeks, it raises additional questions. How did the fires LaBelle saw remain burning or smoldering? And how recently had that stew been cooked? It's possible that LaBelle happened upon the scene at a later point and misjudged how long the fires had been out. If snow and wind were minimal, embers can sometimes remain for days. It's also possible that this 2 months clue was a narrative device added in retellings to dramatize the mystery, suggesting, for instance, that someone might have tended the site in the interim, a truly spooky implication. The Mounties' findings collectively painted a picture that was chilling and deeply puzzling, but offered no clear answers. No bodies or remains of the villagers were found anywhere, not in the village, not in the surrounding wilderness, not under the ice of the lake. It was as if the people had simply vanished into thin air, leaving all their worldly goods behind. No evidence of violence or struggle was present. No blood, no bullet holes, no torn clothing, nothing to suggest an attack by either humans or polar bear. Besides, in that region, wolves or bears could be a threat, but there were no signs of animal predation, and again, the idea that animals dug up a grave without scattering stones is far-fetched. The natural dangers of the area, such as cold or starvation, seemed insufficient to explain an entire group disappearing at once. If they had starved, their bodies would have been found on site. If they had frozen, likewise. If they had fled a coming storm, why leave prepared shelters and supplies, which would be their best chance of survival? The clues pointed in contradictory directions. Some suggested a panicked departure, while others suggested a careful, deliberate process. After documenting everything they could, The RCMP had the task of reporting this baffling situation to their superiors into a world that was about to become fascinated by this story. In the immediate term, however, their priority was the possibility of rescuing survivors. They expanded their search outward, spending days scouring a wider area of the sparsely populated tundra and forest around Lake Anjikuni. They questioned other trappers, traders, and any indigenous residents of nearby encampments. Had anyone seen these missing families? The answer was uniformly no. Not a single neighbor or traveler in the region had seen any large group of Inuit traveling by usual routes or showing up unexpectedly at another location. No refugees from the village ever turned up at trading posts or missions. It was as if that little community had been plucked off the face of the earth. Before departing the empty village, some of the Mounties experienced one more uncanny event. On one of the long Arctic nights during the search, some officers reportedly witnessed strange blue lights low on the horizon over the lake. They described these lights as pulsing bluish orbs, not the usual shimmering curtains of green aurora borealis that frequently dance in polar skies. These lights were different. They hovered and blinked in a manner that did not resemble any natural phenomenon. The northern lights, aurora, are common and well known in these latitudes, but the Mounties insisted these particular lights were not the aurora. The blue, pulsating glows were witnessed just briefly, and then they faded away. The officers later mentioned these mysterious lights in their reports. Perhaps, in the back of their minds, they recalled Armand Laurent's tale of a shape-shifting aerial object a few days earlier. Could there be a connection? At the time, such thoughts were speculative, but the details of the unexplained lights would later feed into some of the more fantastical theories about the fate of the Anjikuni villagers. After exhausting all immediate leads and finding no concrete answers, the RCMP team eventually had to conclude their on-site investigation. They left the silent village of Anjikuni Lake much as they found it, carrying only their notes and a deep sense of unease. The case of the missing village was now officially open, and news of this bizarre discovery was about to spread beyond the remote north, capturing imaginations far and wide. Chapter 3: The Mounties and the Media. In the weeks following the investigation, word of the strange disappearance began to trickle out to the public. The initial report by Joe LaBelle had been sent from the Pas, Manitoba, which in the early 20th century was a frontier town and a transit point for communications in northern Manitoba in what was then the Northwest Territories. The story first surfaced in regional news and then made its way into newspapers further afield. On November 28th and 29th, 1930, a few newspapers carried the incredible tale of the vanishing village. One of the earliest known publications was by Emmett K. Kelleher, a journalist who wrote about northern Canada. Kelleher's account appeared in newspapers such as La Paz Herald in Manitoba, and was soon picked up by at least one American paper, the Bee of Danville, Virginia. Kelleher's article bore a sensational headline: Vanished Eskimo Tribe Gives North Mystery Stranger Than Fiction. The headline itself reads like something out of a dime novel or a penny dreadful, which no doubt helped attract readers' attention. It's worth noting that in 1930, the term Eskimo was commonly used in such articles. Kelleher's newspaper piece vividly described LaBelle's experience and finding at the village. Readers across North America were treated to this dramatic narrative. A seasoned fur trapper finds a normally friendly village of 6 tents completely empty. Food still hang over extinguished fires. 25 men, women, and children gone without a trace. Sled dogs starved to death, and a grave opened. The story was reported as a factual account, but it had all the makings of a classic mystery tale. It's easy to imagine people in 1930 reading it in their local paper over breakfast and feeling a shiver. What could have happened to those people out there in the icy wilderness? The idea of an entire community disappearing resonated strongly, perhaps because it mirrors older legends and real historical mysteries. Shortly after, on November 30th, 1930, a larger Canadian newspaper, the Halifax Herald, in Nova Scotia on the opposite side of the country, ran an article on the story. The Halifax Herald reportedly even referred to the site with the moniker, "The Village of the Dead," in its headline. This phrasing added an extra layer of spookiness and caught readers' imaginations. The notion of a village of the dead in the far north conjures images of a ghost town haunted by some evil or supernatural occurrence. It's not surprising that with such language, the Anjikuni mystery started to take on the quality of legend, almost from the very start of its circulation in print. Over the next few weeks, newspapers in both Canada and the United States briefly buzzed with the story. It was a welcome distraction in many ways. Late 1930 was a grim time globally, with the Great Depression underway. A mystery from the remote Arctic was the kind of human interest story that could captivate the public, if only for a short time. People were left to wonder and speculate what could have forced these Inuit villagers to abandon their homes so suddenly. Was it a natural disaster of some sort? An attack by hostile animals or even hostile humans? There were whispers of strange lights in the sky. Could it have been something from above? The RCMP, for their part, were facing pressure to provide answers. They received numerous inquiries from journalists and concerned citizens asking for updates or verification of the disappearance. The police were cautious in their official communications. They certainly did not want to ignite panic or lend credence to wild theories without evidence. The RCMP's internal investigation continued quietly. In January 1931, Sergeant J. Nelson, the same officer from the PAS who had been involved early on, compiled an internal report on the Anjikuni case. This report was later made public in response to the clamoring for information. Sergeant Nelson's findings were, in effect, a sober debunking of the sensational claims, or at least an expression of deep skepticism. In his report, Sergeant Nelson stated that he could find no foundation for this story. He had looked into every angle and simply found no solid evidence that an entire village had disappeared in the manner described. Nelson noted a few critical points. Joe LaBelle's background. He discovered that LaBelle, the supposed veteran trapper who knew the area intimately, had in fact only taken out his first official trapping license in the late 1930, the very season of the report. This raised questions about how well known and experienced LaBelle truly was. If LaBelle had been in the area before, it might have been informally, perhaps without a license. It didn't prove he was lying, but it suggested he might not have been as seasoned as claimed. The photograph evidence. Kelleher's article had apparently included a photograph, perhaps of an Inuit camp or a family, to illustrate the story. Nelson discovered that one of the photos used was in fact an old image from 1909, taken from RCMP's archives, not a recent snapshot of the Anjikuni Lake Village. This implies the journalist was using stock or unrelated images to dramatize the piece. Kelleher's reputation. Nelson's report politely pointed out that Emmett Kelleher was known for writing colorful stories about the North, basically hinting that he was prone to sensationalism and perhaps not always strictly factual. The RCMP's communication in early 1931 essentially denied any knowledge of a mysterious mass disappearance. The Mounties responded to public inquiries by saying that no such incident had been officially reported or verified, and that nothing unusual had been observed by their patrols in that area. In essence, the RCMP was now treating the Anjikuni affair as a likely hoax or misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion by the media. They announced that they were closing the case due to a lack of evidence. One can imagine the frustration or relief among law enforcement. On one hand, if it truly was a false alarm, they would be relieved that no large loss of life or bizarre event actually happened. On the other hand, if something unexplained did occur, it was disconcerting to have no answers. Officially, however, by late 1931, the position of the RCMP was that the story was fabricated, possibly a journalistic hoax, or at least an exaggerated tale unsupported by facts. The RCMP even suggested at the time that perhaps the whole thing had been invented by someone like Frank Edwards, a writer we'll soon meet, just to sell books, though that was slightly off the mark since the story clearly predated Edwards' involvement. After the flurry of newspaper coverage in 1930 to 1931, and the RCMP's dismissal of the case, the story of the vanishing village rather quickly faded from headlines. The world moved on, and the alleged mystery of Lake Anjikuni slipped into obscurity for a time. It became something of a forgotten footnote, perhaps occasionally mentioned in regional lore. For nearly 3 decades, the tale lay dormant, not widely known beyond those who might recount strange northern yarns by the fireside. However, this was not the end of the Anjikuni saga. It was merely a sleep, waiting for someone to rediscover it and rekindle the intrigue for a new audience. That moment arrived in the late 1950s, when a renewed wave of interest in unexplained phenomena was emerging. Chapter 4: A Mystery Reborn. In 1959, during the height of the Cold War, and a burgeoning public fascination with UFOs, psychic phenomena, and all things paranormal, a writer and radio personality named Frank Edwards published a book titled Stranger Than Science. This book was a compendium of oddities, curiosities, and unsolved mysteries from around the world. Essentially, an early example of the mysteries of the unexplained genre that would become very popular in the 1960s and 1970s. Edwards had a flair for the dramatic and an eye for captivating stories. In compiling material for his book, he stumbled upon the account of the Lake Anjikuni disappearance, perhaps in old newspaper archives or through word of mouth. Finding it suitably intriguing, Edwards decided to include it as one of the chapters in Stranger Than Science. In Edwards' retelling, the story gained a wider audience than ever before. Stranger Than Science sold well and introduced readers across America and beyond to the creepy tale of the village that vanished. Edwards presented the facts much as originally reported. Joe LaBelle's shocking discovery of the deserted camp in all its bizarre clues. But he may have added some embellishments of his own or dramatized the telling, as many popular mystery writers of the time did, to engage readers. Importantly, Edwards treated it as a genuine unsolved mystery. There was no mention of the RCMP debunking it. Whether Edwards was aware of the RCMP statements or not is unclear. It's possible he either did not research that far or he intentionally omitted such details to keep the story alluring. After all, a mystery solved or declared a hoax is far less enticing than a mystery unsolved. The success of Edwards' book effectively revived the Anjikuni legend. Soon, the story started cropping up in other venues, magazines about strange phenomena, other authors' anthologies of unsolved mysteries, and even paranormal radio shows. By the 1960s, as UFO mania picked up, some writers began to reinterpret the Anjikuni disappearance in a new light. Could this have been an incident of mass alien abduction? The detail of mysterious pulsing lights in the sky, seen by the Mounties, and Armand Laurent's report of a flying object were now viewed as tantalizing clues pointing towards an extraterrestrial explanation. In 1976, a book titled The World's Greatest UFO Mysteries by Nigel Blundell and Roger Bohr presented the Anjikuni incident explicitly as a case of possible UFO involvement. This account, and others that followed, tended to amplify the story further. Details that were minor in early reports ballooned to fantastical proportions. For example, some versions inflated the number of missing villagers from 30 to hundreds or even 1,000 people, far beyond any realistic population for a camp in that remote region. Likewise, instead of one disturbed grave, later retellings talked about multiple empty graves or even entire graveyards dug up, which conjures a much more ghoulish scenario. The introduction of 3 prospectors or trappers who supposedly saw a UFO overhead near the village also became a common addition in these UFO-centric narratives. Essentially, each round of republication introduced a bit of story creep, where the tale got a little more dramatic. Fires found still burning, sometimes said to be literally still burning, not just smoldering. Meals left hot and untouched on tables, as if people had evaporated in the middle of supper. And of course, alien ships spiriting people away into the night. It's important to note that these later embellishments are not supported by the original evidence. They represent how legends evolve over time, especially when people with a penchant for the paranormal retell a story to fit a narrative. By the late 20th century, the vanishing village of Anjikuni had taken on the status of a classic unsolved mystery in the pop culture of the paranormal. It was frequently mentioned alongside other famous disappearance legends, acquiring a kind of mythic credibility through sheer repetition. For instance, the story appeared in Whitley Strieber's 1989 novel Majestic, which was a fiction about UFO cover-ups. Strieber included a reference to the Anjikuni incident as if it were one of the great extraterrestrial mysteries of history. Similarly, horror novelist Dean Koontz wrote a thriller called Phantoms in 1983 about a whole town's population mysteriously disappearing. In Phantoms, Koontz explicitly referenced the Lake Anjikuni case, along with the Roanoke colony and others, as part of the lore that the characters discuss when trying to make sense of their town's vanishing. Kuhn's inclusion of it shows how by the 1980s, the Anjikuni story was considered one of the archetypal mass disappearance legend, right up there with the lost colony of Roanoke and its spooky allure. Meanwhile, actual historians and folklorists took a belated interest in whether there was truth behind a tale. In the early 1970s and 1980s, a few researchers attempted to track down original sources. John Robert Colombo, a Canadian author known for collecting ghost stories and folklore, included an entry on the Lake Anjikuni case in one of his books, Ghost Stories of Canada, 1988. Colombo provided both the sensational story and the skeptical perspective, noting that the RCMP had long ago dismissed it. Indeed, as the legend gained more fame, the RCMP themselves felt compelled to comment publicly. On several occasions in the 1970s and 1980s, when asked or when writing about historical oddities, the RCMP reiterated that they had no records of such an incident, and that in their view, the whole thing was an urban legend, or more aptly, a bush legend given its wilderness setting. An official RCMP historical note eventually stated unequivocally that the story was not true and that no evidence ever backed it up. They pointed out that such a large settlement likely never existed in that area to begin with, a claim based on the extreme remoteness and the subsistence limitations of the land, although local Inuits did travel through and camp at the lake. Large permanent villages were uncommon in that exact area. Interestingly, for a time, even skeptics thought the story might have originated not in 1930, but in 1959 with Frank Edwards. Early debunkers suspected Edwards had invented it whole cloth or repeated a tall tale without source. However, later investigation, notably by Brian Dunning, host of the Skeptoid podcast, unearthed the original newspaper references from 1930 to 1931, proving that it was not a 1950s invention, but had actual contemporaneous reports. Dunning's research in 2012 to 2013 traced the story's lineage. He initially was dubious that the 1930s newspaper articles even existed, but then confirmed they did, adjusting his stance to acknowledge the story's origin in journalism of the time, while still doubting its veracity. This kind of scholarly detective work helped clarify that Emmett Kelleher in the Paz, Manitoba, and Danville papers were the true genesis of the story that Edwards later popularized. By the 2000s and 2010s, the Lake Anjikuni disappearance had cemented its place in the pantheon of unexplained mysteries, frequently featured on websites, discussion forums, and even TV shows about the paranormal or unsolved mysteries. It's a story that gets reprinted because it has all the elements: a remote and romantic location, a credible witness encountering an impossible situation, hints of supernatural or extraterrestrial involvement, and no definitive conclusion. It is, in essence, a perfect ghost story from the tundra, one that people can speculate about endlessly. However, as we will explore in the coming sections, there remains a wide gulf between the legend, as popularly told, and the reality that might lie beneath it. To fully appreciate the Anjikuni case, one must examine both the rational explanations that have been offered and the more extraordinary theories that have kept the story alive. We must also consider other occurrences in history that parallel this strange disappearance to see if Anjikuni stands alone or is part of a pattern of legendary vanishments. Before diving into theories, let's pause to summarize the key known facts and likely fictions of the case as it stands. In November 1930, fur trapper Joe LaBelle reported a village of around 25 Inuit missing without a trace at Lake Anjikuni. Clues found: food left cooking, incomplete sewing, 7 sled dogs dead, in an empty grave. RCMP investigated, found no survivors or bodies, noted weird lights, but ultimately found no evidence of foul play or where the people went. The story was reported in newspapers at the time, but then officially denied by RCMP, who could not substantiate it. The tale was revived in 1959 by Frank Edwards and subsequently embellished by others, adding elements like UFOs and increasing the scale of the disappearance. To this day, there is no physical evidence or official records confirming that this disappearance actually happened as described, and many suspect it was a combination of misinterpretation and sensational journalism. With that foundation, we can now explore the spectrum of theories that attempt to explain what really could have happened at Lake Anjikuni. Or was there in fact nothing to explain at all? Chapter 5. Theories and Explanations. The mystery of the lost village of Anjikuni has invited a wide array of explanations, from straightforward to the fantastical. Here we will examine these theories, dividing them broadly into two categories: rational explanations supported by evidence or logical inference, and fringe or extraordinary theories that venture into the paranormal or speculative. For each theory, we will provide the context and reasoning behind it, as well as any known evidence or counter-arguments. It's important to bear in mind that because of the scant hard evidence, none of these theories can be proven definitively, which is exactly why the mystery endures. Rational explanations. 1. Hoax or fabrication. One of the simplest explanations is that the entire episode was a hoax, either an outright invention by Emmett Kelleher or his informant LaBelle, or a vastly exaggerated story spun from a smaller kernel of truth. Skeptics lean heavily on this theory. The known facts supporting it include the RCMP's failure to find concrete evidence, and their conclusion that Kelleher was known for sensationalism. Perhaps Joe LaBelle did stumble upon an empty camp, not an uncommon occurrence that people moved to follow game, and told a tall tale that grew in the telling. It's conceivable that Kelleher, eager for a gripping story, embellished what LaBelle told him. For instance, maybe LaBelle found an abandoned encampment that had been vacated in an orderly way, not suddenly, and Kelleher dramatized it into a sudden vanishing. Or more cynically, maybe Kelleher fabricated the story completely, and LaBelle either didn't exist or was in on it. The lack of corroborating testimony from any other witnesses in 1930 bolsters the hoax theory. So does the absence of any follow-up by local authorities beyond Sergeant Nelson's investigation. One might ask, if 25 people truly vanished, where were the relatives seeking them? Where were the neighboring communities raising an alarm? Northern indigenous communities had connections with one another. Even nomadic groups didn't just disappear without someone noticing. The hoax theory suggests that because it didn't actually happen, there was no ripple effect among local populations, only in the newspaper headlines. The hoax explanation is further strengthened by Kelleher's use of anachronistic photos, implying a willingness to deceive, or at least not let facts get in the way of a good story. In short, the fabrication theory posits that the Anjikuni mystery is a piece of creative fiction that was mistakenly or deliberately passed off as news. 2. Misidentification of a seasonal abandonment. Another rational scenario is that LaBelle encountered a village that had been seasonally abandoned, and he misinterpreted what he saw due to perhaps fear or imagination. Indigenous communities in the Arctic are often nomadic or semi-nomadic, moving with the seasons and following animal migrations. The people at Lake Anjikuni might have been hunting camp that intended to move on when caribou or other game moved. If their departure was done in a normal, non-panicked way, they might leave behind certain items to lighten their load, planning to return later. However, several things make this problematic. Typically, one would not leave essential tools, dogs, or food stores behind in a normal seasonal move. Those all go with the group. Still, it's possible something disrupted their plans. Perhaps the villagers left in a hurry to reach a better hunting ground, or because they received word of some urgent opportunity or danger elsewhere. For example, they might have decided to join a larger group for winter for mutual support, and in doing so, left faster than usual. If LaBelle arrived sometime after they left, normal decomposition in scavengers might have altered the scene. Fires could have gone out, and animals might have eaten or scattered food, making it look as if things were abruptly dropped. The open grave in this context might actually have been a grave that the community relocated. It is known that in some cultures, if a group has to leave a site permanently, they might ritually remove their dead for reburial elsewhere, or carry some relic of the deceased with them. While not common, it's not entirely unheard of. It's also possible that the gravestones were disturbed by natural means or a curious animal, and that LaBelle misread it as a deliberate exhumation. In this mundane scenario, the villagers left for ordinary reasons, perhaps dwindling food or to winter near a trading post for supplies, and the rest is either coincidence or exaggeration. However, critics of this theory point out the dogs. No normal relocation would involve tethering your dogs and leaving them to die. Dogs might be left if the people themselves perished, or something prevented them from returning. So the seasonal move theory struggles to account for the dogs, unless we suppose some calamity befell the people after moving a short distance. Say they left, intending to come back for their dogs or belongings, but then something tragic happened en route, like falling through ice or getting lost in a blizzard. If they died en masse somewhere out of sight, that could leave an entire camp in dead dogs. But again, no bodies were ever found in the surrounding area during searches. 3. Starvation or natural disaster. Could the villagers have succumbed to a natural disaster that left no trace? For example, a sudden famine or disease outbreak might have forced them to attempt an escape or kill them off, leaving their bodies to be scattered. Starvation was a real threat in the Arctic. Inuit oral histories in historical records describe instances of entire families starving when caribou herds changed course unexpectedly, or fish runs failed. The caribou Inuit of the broader region indeed suffered a horrific famine in the late 1940s, documented in Farley Mowat's People of the Deer. And even in the 1930s, life was precarious. If starvation loomed, the group might split up or travel separately to seek food, perhaps leaving the weakest behind and planning to return. Those left might have died, their bodies perhaps removed by the others for burial, or inadvertently lost in the snow. But if a whole group starved in place, their bodies would be there, which they were not. Disease is another possibility. An epidemic like influenza could wipe out a small remote community rapidly. However, even then, bodies would remain, unless we assume some survivors tried to remove them, or they died in such a way that bodies weren't found. There is no record of epidemics in that exact area at that time, and the RCMP would likely have eventually heard of it through medical services or missionaries. As for a natural disaster, one might speculate about a severe blizzard or storm. A blizzard could compel people to leave if, say, they got caught away from camp while hunting and never returned. But then we'd expect to find evidence of people freezing to death outdoors, which again, searchers did not. There's also the notion of a geomagnetic or solar event, highly speculative and not really supported by anything, but some have mused if perhaps a meteor strike or unusual event frightened them into flight. If a meteor had hit the lake or a fireball streaked overhead, could they have all run onto the ice and drowned? Yet there's no evidence of broken ice or meteor in the records. A sudden landslide or flood could conceivably remove people, but Lake Anjikuni's geography isn't known for such phenomena, especially in winter, when water is locked in ice. So most natural disaster scenarios encounter the problem, they either would have remained or do not plausibly fit the environment. 4. Forced relocation or evacuation. Another idea that has been floated is that perhaps the villagers were forcibly relocated by authorities or lured away by prospectors or traders. We know historically that in later decades, 1940s through 50s, the Canadian government did relocate some northern indigenous communities, often to assert sovereignty or for other strategic reasons, sometimes with poor communication to the people involved. However, in 1930, this was not a common practice yet, especially not in so remote a spot for such a small group. There were, though, fur trade companies and missions that sometimes encouraged Inuits to settle around trading posts or mission stations. Could a factor like that have caused the immediate desertion? For example, if a missionary came through and urged them to come to a mission hospital because of an illness, they might have left quickly. Or if the Hudson's Bay's company, which ran trading posts, sent word of supplies or trade opportunities, the community might decide to trek to the post. But leaving valuables and dogs behind still doesn't make sense if it was planned. It's also possible that violence by outsiders, like unscrupulous fur traders or another indigenous group, might have occurred. But again, that would leave signs of struggle, and it's hard to imagine such an event resulting in no trace at all. There were no reports of hostile conflict in that region at that time. The concept of forced relocation as a conspiracy, like secret military or government action, occasionally appears in fringe discussions, but there's zero historical evidence of any such action in 1930 at Lake Anjikuni. 5. They just left. A more prosaic variant of seasonal abandonment is simply that the group decided to leave permanently, perhaps to relocate closer to relatives or to a settlement. If something made that area inhospitable, lack of game, or maybe they believed the place was cursed or unsafe, they might depart and merge with another community. If they left in an orderly way, though, they'd take their dogs and gear. Unless, what if the dogs died before the people left? Perhaps disease or poison feed killed the dogs. The text mentions the dogs were starved, but could a disease have hit them first? If they lost their dogs, the people's mobility would be severely limited. In winter, that's catastrophic. Could they then have themselves starved or been forced to walk out desperately? Perhaps in such a scenario, they might decide to walk to the nearest outpost, leaving non-essentials behind to travel lighter, and along the way, they succumb to the elements. If so, their bodies could be scattered across a vast area, potentially missed by searchers. But the nearest settlements were not impossibly far. One would think some remains or items would be discovered eventually. Over decades, nothing was reportedly found. Considering all these rational angles, the hoax or error explanation remains the strongest. That nothing extraordinary happened, no mass death, no mass abduction, but rather a combination of journalistic sensationalism and perhaps a mundane, empty camp that got mythologized. Nevertheless, as is often the case when official explanations, like "we think it's a hoax," are unsatisfying to the imagination, many have sought answers in the extraordinary. If the conventional doesn't convince, could something beyond conventional understanding have occurred? Extraordinary and fringe theories. 1. Mass alien abduction. Among the paranormal theories, the idea that the villagers were taken by extraterrestrial is the one that has gained the most traction in popular culture. Proponents point to those eerie blue pulsing lights seen by the Mounties and the gleaming shape-shifting object reported by trapper Armand Laurent. They argue that these could have been UFOs, perhaps a single large alien spacecraft, or multiple crafts, which descended on the village and abducted the entire population. The scenario painted by this theory is chilling and cinematic. Imagine the villagers on a dark night seeing strange lights humming in the sky. Then perhaps beams of light or some other force lifting people into the air, explaining why they left mid-meal and mid-task. The dogs might have been left tied up simply because in a chaotic abduction, no one was there to free them. Or possibly, the aliens deliberately left the animals. Some UFO enthusiasts cite other cases of alleged alien abductions, albeit Usually they involve individuals or small groups, like the famous Betty and Barney Hill abduction case of 1961, or the Travis Walton case of 1975. To suggest an entire village was taken is to posit one of the largest scale abduction in lore. It would be one of the earliest too. 1930 is decades before UFOs became widely reported in the 1940s onward. Though there are earlier mysterious airship tales from the 1890s and such. The alien theory also uses the detail of the empty grave in a creative way. Perhaps the aliens even took samples of human remains, the body from the grave, for study, which is why they dug it up. That detail, so hard to explain in normal terms, fits a certain alien modus operandi in the minds of some, reminiscent of cattle mutilation stories or the idea of aliens collecting organisms. Of course, skepticism of this theory is extremely high. There is zero direct evidence of any extraterrestrial involvement, only the unexplained lights, which could have been anything from an atmospheric oddity to a misidentified celestial event, like a bright meteor, which can appear bluish, or even an optical illusion under aurora conditions. The alien abduction theory rests purely on speculation in linking the Anjikuni tale with the broader UFO mythology that became popular after the 1950s. It is more a reflection of human culture, our tendency to ascribe unknowns to aliens, than of any real investigative finding. Nonetheless, it remains an intriguing and terrifying notion, as some writers put it. The idea that an entire community could be silently whisked away by otherworldly beings in the northern sky. 2. Supernatural forces, spirits, or monsters. Going beyond aliens, some have looked into the indigenous lore of the region for possible supernatural explanations. The Inuit and other First Nations have rich mythologies of spirits, creatures, and curses associated with the land. One often mentioned being, though actually from Algonquin traditions rather than Inuit, is the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit or monster associated with cannibalism and winter starvation. Wendigo stories tell of an evil entity that possesses people or stalks the forest, and sometimes entire communities would fear its presence if famine loomed. Could the people of Anjikuni have fallen victim to a Wendigo? Perhaps one person in the village turned Wendigo through cannibalistic insanity brought on by hunger, and the others fled in terror. That's one folkloric scenario. However, as romantic as that sounds, it doesn't square well with the evidence. Also, the cultural mismatch is an issue. Wendigo legends are more prevalent among the Cree and Ojibwe to the south of Inuit territory. In Inuit lore specifically, there are entities like the Tornk or the Tornkasuk, which are powerful spirits or sometimes considered a god of the sky or weather. Some storytellers have speculated if the sky deity Tornkasuk or some curse of the shaman could have caused the village to vanish into the spirit world. Another figure is the Kalupalik, a sort of sea hag or mermaid-like creature in Inuit legend that lives in the water and steals children by luring them close with a humming sound, while a kalupalik targets individuals, especially naughty children near the shore. Someone with a flair for imagination might wonder if a host of a kalupalik emerged from the lake to drag everyone beneath the waves. If so, why were no holes in the ice or wet evidence? That's hard to say. The story quickly veers into pure fantasy here. Some have even floated the idea of a dimensional portal or time vortex opening up at Lake Anjikuni, swallowing the village. This is more a science fiction twist than folklore, but it gets mentioned in the same breath as Bermuda Triangle type phenomena. Without any evidence, it's just another wild hypothesis. Maybe the fabric of reality thinned for a moment, and the villagers walked into another realm, whether spirit world or parallel dimension. It's the kind of thing you'd find in a Twilight Zone episode. One point supporting a supernatural angle, at least in the minds of believers, is that the scene had a very haunted quality. The idea of unfinished daily tasks, as if people vanished in an instant, is reminiscent of the Mary Celeste ghost ship. Crew vanished, leaving dinner on the table. Or the Flannan Isles lighthouse mystery, where the table was set with food, but the keepers were gone. In many ghost stories, locations are found deserted with things frozen in time, suggesting some curse or supernatural calamity. So, some paranormal enthusiasts might say the Anjikuni site felt like that. Hence, perhaps an evil spirit was at work. Far-fetched as these things are, it's noteworthy that they continue to capture interest. Even the original Historic Mysteries article mused in a storytelling way that Native American myths are filled with evil creatures, cannibals, and monsters. Maybe LaBelle had just missed encountering such monsters in the frozen wilderness of the North. This line underscores how tempting it is to fill the vacuum of evidence with mythical dangers. 3. Psychological or environmental factors. Another theory, less supernatural than psychological, wonders if perhaps the villagers experienced some form of mass hysteria or panic triggered by an environmental event. For example, the northern lights themselves or a meteor could have frightened them, though Inuits are quite familiar with aurora and have their own interpretations, usually not fear-based. Or perhaps a hallucinogenic toxin entered their food supply. Certain molds or toxins in poorly prepared food can cause disorientation and fear. If, say, they ate some bad seal meat or something contaminated, could they have collectively lost rationality and wandered off? It's a stretch, and again, where do they go? Another angle. Could this have to do with the Franklin's Lost Expedition? Interestingly, in 1948, the famous writer-explorer Farley Mowat visited Anjikuni Lake and found a mysterious cairn with a strange wooden box fragment. Mowat speculated that perhaps a member of Sir John Franklin's 1840s lost expedition, specifically Francis Crozier, might have wandered here and built that cairn. While that historical tidbit doesn't directly explain a 1930 disappearance, it adds a layer of mystique to the area. The notion that the region had seen another ghostly trace of lost souls decades prior. It's possible that local folklore around Anjikuni Lake included other strange happenings or bad omens, which could psychologically prime people to think of the place as haunted or cursed. If the villagers themselves believed something was wrong with the area, whether spirits or perhaps they observed unusual animal behavior, they might have abruptly decided to leave. In their haste, or due to fear, they might have done things that seem irrational, like not properly packing or freeing animals. Fear can cause people to act in ways that later look bizarre to outside observers. This theory of a panicked evacuation under duress, but not from a tangible pursuer, is hard to prove or disprove. It tries to find a middle ground. No aliens, no hoax, but a human reaction to something perceived as frightening, be it an unknown light in the sky, a strange noise, or a cultural superstition. We still have to answer why none of it made it to safety or were found. Perhaps they split up and succumbed to the elements one by one, their bodies lost in snow or crevices. The Canadian Barrens are vast and at the time unmapped in detail. It's conceivable a small group could vanish traveling through them, but all 25 without a trace is still unlikely unless they went under ice or into water, which again will usually leave some floating debris or wash-up remains. 4. Comparison to other disappearances. Sometimes a theory isn't a single explanation, but a pattern-matching exercise. People compare Anjikuni to other cases. The Flannan Isle lighthouse keepers in 1900. 3 men disappeared from a lighthouse in Scotland. Official explanation was a giant wave swept them to sea, though legend speaks of ghosts or a sea serpent. The Mary Celeste in 1872. The ship found adrift with crew missing. Probably they abandoned ship due to perceived danger, like possible explosion, but no one knows for sure. The lost colony of Roanoke of 1587 to 1590. Over 100 colonists vanished, likely assimilated with local Native Americans or moved, yet legend posits they vanished mysteriously. By drawing parallels, some imply maybe an unknown force or common thread links such events, as if there's some mysterious phenomenon that occasionally causes groups to disappear. In fiction, this sometimes is portrayed as an entity or curse that moves from place to place. In reality, each case has its own context and likely prosaic explanation, but the mystique grows when they're lumped together. Given these manifold theories, each with their merits and faults, what are we to believe about Lake Anjikuni? To distill, the most evidence-backed stance is that no inexplicable event happened, that it was at best a misinterpreted abandoned camp, or at worst, a concocted story. The RCMP and skeptical researchers favor this view. The apparent lack of follow-up evidence strongly supports it. Yet, the legend persists in large part because of the gap in knowledge. Humans are naturally drawn to fill gaps with narrative. The unknown fate of the villagers, if we assume they did exist and did disappear, taps into deep fears of isolation and the power of nature to erase us. Before concluding, let's explore briefly those comparisons to put Anjikuni in context. This will help us see if the Anjikuni mystery is truly unique or part of a larger tapestry of disappearance lore. Chapter 6: Parallel Mysteries in History. The story of the lost village of Anjikuni often reminds people of several other famous mysteries where a group of people disappeared, seemingly without explanation. While these events are unrelated in time and place, they provide context and perhaps insight into how such stories are remembered and interpreted. We now dive into a few of these parallels, giving each the detail and background it merits. The lost colony of Roanoke. This is one of the oldest and most famous mass disappearance cases on record. In 1587, during the early attempts by the English to colonize North America, a group of about 115 settlers, men, women, and children, established a colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The governor of the colony, John White, sailed back to England that year to procure more supplies, leaving his family and the colonists behind. Due to war and delays, White could not return until 1590, 3 years later. When he finally did, he found the colony site completely abandoned. The buildings had been dismantled or removed, which implies a nonviolent departure, as they weren't burned or wrecked. There were no human remains and no obvious signs of struggle. The only clue was the word Croatoan, carved into the palisade of the fort, and the letters CRO carved into a tree. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, now Hatteras Island, and also referred to a local Native American tribe. White interpreted the carving to mean the colonists had perhaps moved to Croatoan Island. Unfortunately, a storm prevented White from searching further, and he returned to England without ever locating the colonists. The fate of the lost colony of Roanoke has since been a topic of endless speculation. The primary theories are they assimilated with the Croatoan Native Americans, moving south and being absorbed into local tribes. Later reports from Jamestown colonists in 1607 include accounts of Native Americans with European features or knowledge of English, who might have been descendants of Roanoke colonists. They tried to sail back to England on their own and were lost at sea. They were killed or abducted by the Spanish, who had a presence in Florida, or by hostile mainland tribes, though there's scant evidence for a mass slaughter. Something more eerie, because the word Croatoan has shown up in other unexplained contexts. Edgar Allan Poe reportedly uttered it before death, and it's been linked to other legends. It got a supernatural mystique in popular culture as almost a curse word marking disappearance. For our purposes, Roanoke shows a lack of closure lead to myth-making, although the likely mundane answer is that it integrated with Native Americans to survive. The enduring image is of a colony vanishing, leaving only a cryptic word, a real-life riddle. Comparatively, Anjikuni had the elements of daily life left behind, and no clue like Croatoan, making it even starker, a blank mystery. Roanoke at least had a hint, which many takes as a sign of relocation. In Anjikuni, not even a carved message was found. Still, both feature in a list of history's strangest disappearances. For more detail on the lost colony of Roanoke, we have a full episode, which you can find on our channel. The Mary Celeste, 1872, Atlantic Ocean. The saga of the Mary Celeste is a maritime mystery rather than a land-based community, but it shares the motif of an abandoned scene that seems eerily preserved. The Mary Celeste was an American brigantine merchant ship that set sail from New York in November 1872, bound for Genoa with a cargo of industrial alcohol. On December 5, 1872, another ship, the De Gracia, a Canadian brig, found the Mary Celeste adrift in the mid-Atlantic near the Azores. The ship was in sound and seaworthy condition. When the crew of the De Gracia boarded the Mary Celeste, they found no one on board. The captain, his wife, and young daughter, and the 7 crew members had all vanished. There was no sign of struggle or piracy. The cargo was largely intact, though a few barrels of alcohol were later found to be empty, possibly due to leakage. The ship had ample provisions, about 6 months' worth of food and water, still stored. The personal belongings of the crew were in place. Notably, one of the ship's lifeboats was missing, which indicates the people likely boarded it and left the ship. The last log entry was over a week earlier. A few clues. Some sails were set awkwardly or missing. A pump was disassembled, and there was about 3.5 feet of water in the hold. Not catastrophic for a ship of that size, but possibly alarming to a crew if they thought more water was coming in. Over the years, many theories have been proposed. Lifeboat evacuation due to fear of explosion. One theory is that fumes from the alcohol cargo, some barrels of which were made of more porous red oak, built up, and perhaps there was a small explosion or strong smell, leading the captain to fear a catastrophic explosion. They may have temporarily abandoned ship in the lifeboat to wait it out, tethered to the ship, but then the rope could have parted, leaving them behind as empty ship sailed on. If the lifeboat then capsized or was lost, the people would have perished at sea. Storm or waterspout. Perhaps a sudden weather event convinced them the ship was foundering, though the ship clearly survived whatever it was. Piracy or foul play. This was dismissed due to no sign of violence and nothing stolen. Mutiny. Also seems unlikely, as they would presumably sail somewhere rather than leave the ship intact. Seaquake. An underwater earthquake could jolt a ship and cause weird effects like fumes from cargo or dislodging the chronometer, scaring the crew. Paranormal. And, of course, supernatural ideas from ghost ships to sea monsters have been attached to the legend in fiction and lore. The Mary Celeste case has been studied extensively, and a plausible scenario like the explosion fear has emerged as likely. But because no one from the Mary Celeste was ever found, it holds that ghostly mystique. In relation to Anjikuni, Mary Celeste's empty ship with personal effects intact is like a maritime version of LaBelle's empty village with food and clothes intact. Both invite the question, why would they leave these things unless something extraordinary happened? In Mary Celeste's case, a technical situational problem likely triggered a rational, though ultimately fatal decision. For example, the captain's misjudgment. Could Anjikuni similarly have a rational trigger that we just don't have record of? Perhaps something like fear of an impending disaster, real or imagined, made the villagers decide to leave quickly. The difference is that the Mary Celeste people had a lifeboat and likely intended to return or reach safety, whereas the Anjikuni people had nowhere obviously better to go without their dogs. The concept of fear of explosion on a ship loosely parallels perhaps the fear of some curse or hostile force on land. In both cases, people abandon a secure situation due to perceived threat. For more information on the Mary Celeste, we have a full episode on it on our channel. The Flannan Isle Lighthouse Keepers, 1900 Scotland. On a remote rocky island of the Flannan Isles in the Outer Hebrides, 3 lighthouse keepers vanished in December 1900. When a relief vessel arrived on December 26, they found the lighthouse unstaffed. Inside, certain peculiar details were noted. The last entry on the slate was made on the 15th. 2 of the 3 oilskin raincoats were gone, implying 2 men had gone outside. One left his coat behind. A meal was left on the table, and the kitchen was in a state as if someone left in the middle of preparation. This detail has been exaggerated in some retellings. Some say they found a chair overturned and half-eaten food, but official reports mention that the lamp was trimmed and refilled. The official investigation concluded that the men most likely were swept away by a freak wave while attending to storm damage or securing equipment on a cliffside. Evidence supporting this are heavy storm damage was observed at a landing platform and supply boxes. A handrail was bent out of shape. It seems the keepers went out into a raging storm, perhaps against protocol, but maybe urgently trying to fix something like a crane or box, and a series of large waves caught them. The mystery got embellished, for example, in often cited but fictional logbook, with entries about great storm, strange feelings, and one man praying. This log was later admitted to be a fabrication by an author in the 1920s. Still, the Flannan Isle story became famous, inspiring poems, songs, and endless speculation of sea monsters or ghostly intervention. But most evidence point to a tragic accident. The Flannan keepers likely died from a natural cause, but absence of bodies in the lonely setting gave it a supernatural patina and lore. At Anjikuni, there was no obvious natural cause, like wave or avalanche, but one could imagine an analogous scenario. What if something forced the villagers to a particular spot, like Flannan's West Landing, and there they perished? For example, if they all fled onto the frozen lake surface for some reason, and the ice broke, they could all plunge into freezing water and not resurface. Could the entire village have gathered on the lake? It sounds odd, but maybe if they saw something terrifying on land, say a wildfire, or believed a creature was coming from the woods, going onto the open ice might seem safer until the ice cracks. This, however, is speculative to the extreme, and the Mounties didn't report unusual cracks or holes in the ice beyond normal. The Flannan story shows how even a well-investigated accident can spawn wild theories, whereas Anjikuni, poorly documented and investigated, is even more a blank canvas for the imagination. Rua Verde, the vanished Brazilian village, 1923. This is an interesting parallel to bring up, because it shows how urban legend can propagate even if the event never occurred. Hoa Verde supposedly was a small village in Brazil where in 1923, 600 inhabitants all disappeared overnight, leaving behind houses with half-eaten meals and a gun with an inscription, "There is no salvation," on a blackboard. Sound familiar? It's like a tropical echo of Anjikuni's story, but on a bigger scale. However, researchers and Brazilian historians have found no evidence that Hoa Verde ever existed, or that such an event was recorded in 1923. It appears to be a modern myth, possibly originating from sensational articles or internet-era rumors. Despite this, it often makes rounds in unsolved mystery lists. The persistence of the Hoa Verde legend, despite likely being totally fictional, underscores how appealing these mass disappearance stories are. Humans are fascinated by the idea of a community vanishing, perhaps because it upends our sense of security in numbers and the normal order of life. It's the village-level equivalent of a ghost ship. With Hoa Verde, since it's likely a fabrication, it parallels the idea that maybe Anjikuni too could have ended up just a well-circulated myth had we not found the initial news source. Other ghost villages and legends. History and folklore have a few other tales. In the 18th century, a settlement of Highlanders in Scotland supposedly vanished, but that turned out to be a fictional short story's plot, not a real event. There are also myths among indigenous people. For example, some Inuit legends tell of villages cursed by spirits, causing everyone to leave, or of shadow people stealing folks away. These are more metaphorical or moral tales, rather than historical accounts. Nonetheless, when the Anjikuni story surfaced, people in the Arctic might have recalled such legends, giving it an air of plausibility within their cultural context. One might wonder if perhaps Kelleher, or someone who fed him the story, had heard a local legend and transformed it into a current event news story. Without accusing anyone specific, it wouldn't be the first time a traditional tale got refashioned as news for exotic flair. After exploring these parallels, we observe a pattern. In many disappearance cases, the most likely explanations are mundane: assimilation with another group for Roanoke, a wave for Flannan Isle, evacuation miscalculation for Mary Celeste. But people often prefer the mystery intact, and when an explanation is lacking or unsatisfying, legends flourish. Now turning back to Anjikuni with fresh eyes from these comparisons. If we apply Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest adequate explanation is usually the correct one, we lean toward the idea that either nothing mysterious happened or something relatively ordinary happened. The extraordinary theories, while entertaining, require us to accept phenomena for which there is no empirical evidence. It is worth noting one more piece of context: the environment and era in which the Anjikuni story arose. The Arctic in the 1930s was on the cusp of change. The traditional nomadic life of many Inuit was beginning to be impacted by increased contact with the outside world, traders, missionaries, and soon administrative authorities. But still, there were vast areas with minimal oversight, where small groups moved without documentation. If a tragedy befell one such group, in 1930, it might not have been widely known. The RCMP had only so many patrols. They might miss evidence or not have full knowledge of every community's comings and goings. Thus, it's not impossible that a genuine disappearance could have happened and left scant evidence, which got sensationalized. That scenario might combine truth and myth. Maybe a trapper found an empty camp that had been abandoned because the people left for urgent reasons, like chasing a caribou migration, and tragically died elsewhere. And then the press turned that into a mystery legend when the story was relayed poorly. In any event, after covering everything from the prosaic to the preposterous, we find ourselves still with an unsolved enigma. If one is inclined toward skepticism, the matter is settled by considering it a yarn that got out of hand. If one is inclined towards wonder, the unanswered question, what were those lights? Why the grave? Why the dogs? Allow the mystery to breathe on in imagination. Chapter 7, An Enduring Legend. As we draw this exploration to a close, it's fitting to reflect on why the last village of Anjikuni continues to capture our collective imagination in such a profound way. In a sense, the Anjikuni tale has taken a life beyond its factual basis, evolving into a kind of modern myth or cautionary tale. Whether it actually happened or not, it resonates with themes that are deeply rooted in human storytelling. The fragility of community, the vast unknown of the wilderness, and the idea of people being here one moment and gone the next. A stark reminder of the impermanence and uncertainty of life. Picture Lake Anjikuni today. It lies in what is now Nunavut, a remote expanse of rock-rimmed water and tundra under an enormous sky. It is quiet, uninhabited, except perhaps for the migratory caribou and the cry of distant birds. One can imagine that if you visited the site of the old village, you might feel a somber hush. Perhaps there is nothing visibly remaining, no decaying tents or hearth after all this time. But in one's mind's eye, you might sense the echoes of human laughter that once was, and then the pressing silence that followed. The story has a meditative quality when told softly. A traveler arrives expecting warmth and hospitality, and instead finds stillness and mystery. It's almost allegorical, like a parable about isolation or the unknown. It becomes the kind of narrative that one might hear on a late-night radio show that mixes fact and folklore, lulling the listener into a dreamlike contemplation of what might dwell beyond the edge of our understanding. The Inuit perspective might also add depth. In their culture, great value is placed on community and helping one another survive in the harsh climate. The thought of an entire community disappearing would be a profound tragedy. It's said in some retellings that local Inuits to this day treat the Anjikuni legend as a ghost story, a reminder of either a spirit's wrath or a simple warning that the land must be respected because it can swallow you without a trace if you're not careful. The RCMP's official stance today is that the Anjikuni mystery is nothing more than an urban legend. And indeed, in recent communications, notably a 2005 historical note on their website, they even incorrectly claimed Frank Edwards started it, illustrating that even official memory can be faulty. But official stance rarely kill legends. If anything, the blunt denial, it's not true, there's no evidence, sometimes spurs believers to cling harder to the notion that they must be covering something up, or there's more to it that authorities don't want us to know. As the Paranormal Scholars article insightfully noted, once fact gives way to fiction with time, the two become nearly impossible to separate. The Anjikuni case has reached that point, a blend of documented fact and layers of myth. For those of us intrigued by mysteries, but also anchored by evidence, perhaps the most satisfying approach is to say, if something real did happen, it was likely prosaic and tragic, perhaps a group that met misfortune and whose story got embellished because the truth was never fully found out. If nothing happened, then it's a testament to our love of a good story that we keep retelling it. In either case, it serves a function. It reminds us of the unknown in an age where we often feel everything is mapped, monitored, and explained. A story like that of Anjikuni Lake gives us a small, safe encounter with the mysterious and unexplained. It lets our minds wander in the dark, pondering possibilities before we return to the comfort of the known. Consider again the still waters of Lake Anjikuni at dusk. The sky is deep blue, the first stars appearing. A gentle wind ripples the surface. And for a moment, maybe the aurora borealis shimmers faintly. They searched and never found not a single soul, only silence and snow, and the questions left behind. How many secrets does the far north hold in its quiet, frozen embrace? The tale of the lost village of Anjikuni may be one secret that was never meant to be fully revealed. Instead, it lingers as a whisper on the wind, a riddle that keeps us wondering. And in that wondering, there is a strange comfort as we gently close the book and our eyes, knowing that some mysteries, like the stars over the Arctic, will continue to shine quietly, whether we solve them or not.